Welcome back to part 3 of our floors and ceilings analysis in Python for NBA Daily Fantasy Sports using our Pandas module. In the previous 2 videos, we've gone over what the mean is, what the standard deviation is, what the z-score is, how to conceptualize them, how to visualize them, how to think about them, and how we can, at least we've started to talk about how we can apply it to our daily fantasy strategies. So today we're going to go one step further, and we're actually going to start applying it, or at least looking at how we can apply it. One of the main things we're going to hit today is going to be how to factor in how many games a player has played for the team that they have your mean and standard deviation with, as well as how that can impact things and kind of skew our data and why it's important to factor that data in. So this video is going to be quite a bit shorter than our second video. That went a lot longer than I intended, but once I went to editing it, it all fit together, and I didn't really want to cut a whole lot out. So that just leaves us less to do in part 3, so this one will be a lot shorter, don't worry. So let's go ahead and hop into it. First thing we're going to do is import our pandas module, pull in our data frame, and if you recall from previously, we worked a lot with Marcus Morris, and we identified that he had been traded over the course of that season, and he'd only played 2 or 3-ish games with the Clippers at the time that I pulled this data set. So we're going to go ahead and create our Marcus Morris data frame. And as we can see, we only have 3 games with the Clippers. Okay, and this is where it's going to become important. Because up to this point, he had been playing with the Knicks. Now he's on the Clippers. His stats with the Knicks aren't necessarily going to be reflected in his stats with the Clippers and vice versa. However, in our last video, we broke out the mean and standard deviation by team as well as by player. And it showed that he had a very low standard deviation with the Clippers, something like 2, something stupidly small. And if you're not paying attention to that kind of stuff and just kind of on autopilot running over the data, or maybe this is an automated process for you, those are things that can really throw your data out of whack and your projections out of whack as a result. So, some things we can do. We're going to go ahead and add in the same things we did in our previous video, so none of this is new. We're adding in standard deviation and mean based off of team, and now we check Marcus Morris again, and we can see that yes, he had a 2.17 standard deviation with the Clippers and a 24.9 mean with the Knicks. So if you just had this data that ran like this, no more checks, no more balances, your algorithm would think that he is a significantly more consistent player with the Clippers than he was with the Knicks. And that's not necessarily the case. It's also going to peg his floors and his floor much higher, his ceiling much lower, because you remember the probability within 1, 2, 3 standard deviations of the mean. He's only going 2 points above this, so round that up to 25, round that down to 2. 3 standard deviations away only bumps him up to 31 points, and that puts him at a very low percentage possibility that he scores that many points, which isn't realistic. So it can help you and it can hurt you, depending on what you're looking for. So how do we factor in how many games they've played? How do we calculate that without manually going through and tallying them up? Well, first off, we're going to create a new data frame that's just going to be our players, their team, their mean, their standard deviation, because as far as that's concerned, we don't need all of this. We don't need their specific fantasy points. We're just interested in standard deviation, mean, team, and player for this purpose, because those are going to be the things that matter. And in reality, we could probably just do player and team, but we're going to do player, team, mean, standard deviation, and we're going to sort by standard deviation with the lowest numbers first. So look at these, and we can see Marcus Morris is actually the 3rd smallest standard deviation in our data set, with Glenn Robinson the 3rd with Philly. I believe he was traded that season. Dwayne Dedman, I know, was traded that season. Looks like we have Chris Chiozza with 2 different teams. Interesting. Matthew Dellavedova, he was not traded, but he's... And that's where you want to double check. Like Semi Ojeleye, I know he played for Boston the whole season, low standard deviation. A lot of players with low standard deviations are going to be more of those low-minute role players that, you never ask a whole lot out of them, but they are very consistent in what they give you. So a Semi comes in, he's going to hit down a couple shots, maybe grab a steal, couple rebounds, call it a day, right? Nothing major. And he can occasionally see a lot more minutes, but his production doesn't necessarily scale up that well with minutes. So that's another important thing to factor in. And we can throw Marcus Morris out, Dwayne Dedmon out, Glenn Robinson out. We know where they were traded outside of those guys. It looks like Chris Chiozza is going to be our highest mean of only 14.375 points, which is not ideal for daily fantasy purposes. So what can we do here? We are going to add a new column to this data frame called the key, and it's just going to be a concatenation of the player name and the team abbreviation. And then we are going to create a new data frame called our DF player team, and it's going to be our data frame players grouped by the key that we just created, and then we're going to count the key. So if we take a look at this, we now have a key, and again it's just the player name concatenated with the team abbreviation, and then we are going to count by key how many entries there are in our data frame. And then we're just going to reset our index, and then we're just going to take a look at key and player because we don't need everything else. So we have our key and we have our player, and player is going to be the count basically. So Aaron Gordon with Orlando played 49 games, Aaron Holiday, Indianapolis 49, Abdul Nader, OKC 34, so on and so forth. And right now it's sorted alphabetical by player name. So now we have our count of how many games that player played for that team, which is pretty handy. So what we're going to do now is we're going to merge our data sets together on the key. And to do that, we need to first merge this data frame, just the key and player, back onto our DF players because we already have the key there. So that's what we do here. Now if we take a look at DF players again, we can see that now we have, and this is one thing that will happen, it's good to know. If you do not specify what to do, if you come across a column name that already exists, it will apply an _X to your left data set and an _Y to your right data set column name. So we see here, we have a whole bunch of Anthony Simons entries, all for Portland. That's because we're working off of our box score information. So it's going to create that extra column or two for every single entry here. We don't need that, right? We just need one entry per player team combination because we're looking at mean standard deviation, which is going to be the same across the season because we're using this season's worth of data sets. If it's something that you're calculating daily after every new game for that player of the season up to that point, then it would vary day by day because you're adding in new data as you go. This is a static data set, it's not changing. So next thing we want to do is we've merged, we've looked at it. Now we're just going to rename, we're going to redefine our columns data there, columns attributes. So we're going to just do player team, mean, standard deviation, key, and we're going to change this to games. So we have the number of games. And just to verify that, we can see that it's updated to exactly what we told it. You will get an error here if you do not specify a column name for every column in your data set. Just a heads up there, you do not need a name for the index. And then we're just going to drop duplicates because we only need one per player team combination. And remember, we are going to differentiate. It needs to be the same across the board, which we know it will be because it's a static data set. So we drop our duplicates. And now we only have one Anthony Simons, then CJ McCollum, Kyle Korver, Kyle Kuzma, LeBron James. Okay? Now let's go back to Marcus Morris and take a look at what we have. So we can see up to that point, he had played 43 games with the Knicks and 3 with the Clippers. So suddenly, this standard deviation makes a lot more. He's only played 3 games, right? So it's calculating everything we did before on mean, standard deviations, all of that, off of just 3 values. So where you want to draw the line on how many values is enough, how much is not enough, that's going to be kind of up to you and your situation. It will be reflected kind of upon the size of your data set. I would recommend using maybe a certain percentage of your data set is a minimum. Like if the highest point is 54 games, let's say, maybe we only want to look at players that have played, 15 games or more with their team. But it's not necessarily across the board. Someone like LeBron, you could probably be pretty confident they're going to put out similar numbers regardless of what team they're on. So it just varies. And that's kind of going to be up to you and your specific situation and what you're using with whatever data sets you have. So what I'm just going to use for this example is they need to have played greater than or equal to, correct? Yep, greater than or equal to 20 games for their respective team. So if we do that, and we run the describe function just to kind of look at the mean standard deviation in games and what we're working with. So the average number of games played is going to be 43.9 once we drop off anyone who's played less than 20 games. Okay, the average standard deviation is going to be 9.4, and the average is going to be 23.719. We can see the minimum standard deviation now is 5.06. The maximum is 15.366. And same with the average number of fantasy points scored. The minimum is going to be 7.64 for players that have scored or played more than 20 games or more, and the max is going to be an average of 57.63. Okay, and these are not necessarily coming from the same player record either. This is across the entire data set, so keep that in mind as well. So now if we take a look and we want to sort standard deviation, remember we're using our DF20 sort, and the default sort is ascending from smallest to largest. Sorting on standard deviation, we're going to be sorting from the smallest to the highest, and we can see our minimum standard deviation was 5.06, and sure enough, that is our first value here. So Theo Pinson played 23 games, averaged 11 points, standard deviation of 5. Okay, and you may notice a lot of these are going to be role players, pretty much all role players that are going to be pretty consistent guys for what they give. They're not going to give you a ton, but you kind of know what you're getting with them when you put them in the game. And most of them have played, 40 or more games, so it's not like it's a ton of small sample size games like Theo here. If we do sort by the mean, lowest to highest, and we have 7.64 as the lowest mean, which matches here our describe function, so we can feel pretty confident about that. And we've got some overlap here. Games are going to be a little bit more varied, but still quite a few. Nothing major surprising here. So now we're only going to take a look at players who have played 20 or more games and they average 20 or more points, right? Because let's be honest, if we're making our lineups, aside from the very, very unique scenario where someone that averages, 7 to 15 points a game is just primed with injuries, they're going to be the #1 option, they're going to get all the looks they want, they're going to have a much bigger game than normal, right? And those are going to be one-off scenarios that are very hard to capture in a machine learning algorithm because it is going to give you the most likely scenario. And it can only look at past data. It's not looking at future and being like, oh, I can see into the future and know this is a great scenario. There's things you can do to feed in projections, and so you can say it's going to get a lot more minutes, maybe you bump up the expected usage, etc. But it's going to be within a smaller band than what you're probably looking for in most scenarios, obviously not every scenario. So that might be something you go in and manually do anyways. So for our purposes, we're only going to be looking at players that are averaging more than 20 points a game. And then if we sort by standard deviation, we jump up to our lowest being 6.97, which was on our previous. Oh, it was not. Almost. 6.26. So we've got Terrence Ross with Orlando, 6.97. That's relatively low. If we remember in part 2 with Aaron Gordon, I believe he was sitting at 9 something, his standard deviation. So he's not terribly far off, but remember, for every point this goes up, that's going to be increasing your range by 2 points for every standard deviation bound you go out. And if we look at these guys, they're going to be pretty consistent players. Some of them get a little more action than others. We can see, Colin Sexton and Evan Fournier, Gallinari. I mean, Dano's got averaging 30 points a game with the second lowest standard deviation. Like that's pretty good. I mean, the next highest, we're going to have a couple 28s in Evan Fournier, Colin Sexton, Bogdanovich, and then most of them are going to be low 20s at the lower bound of what we're allowing points-wise into this. And that's to be expected because your players that typically score a lot are going to have a little bit higher standard deviations just because there's more wiggle room the higher up you get. Like if you're a player that averages 40 points a game, you're going to have a lot more swings up to 55 or down to 25, whereas someone who averages 20 points a game, they're not going to have very many games where they only score 5, right? Because there's the amount of time they're on the floor, if they're averaging 20, they're going to get a minimum number of looks, right? So I hope that makes sense a little bit. So we can go ahead and take a look at the highest to lowest average fantasy points per game. So number 1 at this point in time in that season was Giannis Antetokounmpo, followed by James Harden, Luka Doncic, Anthony Davis, LeBron James, Karl Anthony Towns. None of these are surprising here. You know, they're all high profile, high scoring players, have big impact. Now if we look at the standard deviation though, we're going to notice some things. Giannis at 10.9 is pretty good, and I think anyone who plays DFS or follows NBA remotely knows that Giannis is going to, especially a couple years ago before they got in like Drew Holiday and before some of their younger players had developed a little more, Giannis was the player for Milwaukee, right? Everything ran through him. Not that it doesn't run through him anymore, but it ran through him to a much more significant level at that point in time. Whereas James Harden, you know, he's got a standard deviation of 4 points higher. So that's going to be an 8-point swing going +1 and -1 standard deviation each time, right? So if we want to look at Giannis and we take his mean and we go up 2 standard deviations, that's 11.58. So that's 22 points swing, or if we're just going positive, let's say it's a good matchup, we're adding 11. So now we're all of a sudden we're up at 70 points. But a bad game, you know, we're only down to 46 points, 47 points. Whereas Harden, he's going to have that 28-point range there. That's a much wider range to work with. More consistent player. AD, that isn't that surprising to me. I know AD is a great player, and he seems like he should be consistent, but he's surprisingly up and down. I'm sure a lot of that has to do with injuries and minute differences, and that's something we've not factored in here. We've just factored in games they were in the box score, right? So players like Anthony Davis that frequently go out early in a game are going to inherently have a standard deviation if minutes is not something that you're accounting for in your calculations. Whereas LeBron, he might be the lowest on this list. Nope, Kawhi is the lowest on this list. Again, not surprising. Kawhi is a very consistent performer. He's not the most exciting player, but he gets in the game, and he does his business every time he gets in the game. And a lot of that can come down to him getting, you know, more rebounds and steals, because those are things that are more hustle, whereas points, maybe you're not getting open looks. That's why you see some big men are going to have, like Andre Drummond's going to have a lower standard deviation than Trae Young. Jokic is a little bit different because he kind of does a lot of things, but like Joel Embiid, 11.9, that's going to be pretty low. Surprisingly, Russell Westbrook is an 11.79. A lot of people like to rag on Westbrook that he's inconsistent, but and it might be just out of volume, you know, he's always doing things. But still, he's technically more consistent than Karl Anthony Towns, than Anthony Davis, than Luka Doncic, than James Harden. He's a lot more consistent than a lot of players that you would think of. One thing you'll probably notice is a lot of the boomer bust players are going to be your smaller guards, like a Kyrie Irving, a Trae Young, a Dame Lillard. James Harden, I mean, he's not a smaller guard, but still the very ball-dominant, shooting-dependent players, because if they're having an off night, they're going to score much lower. And if they're having a good night, they're going to score a ton, right? So different play styles, I hope you can see here, are going to lean themselves towards having a wider or narrower standard deviation. And taking a look at the highest standard deviation players on this list, no surprise there for me. These all seem to be very inconsistent players as far as we're concerned for this data set. Damien Lillard is probably the only one that surprises me a little bit. As a small guard, it's a lot harder for him to just always get everything he wants. Trae Young, he's doing much better now in his career than he was at this time. There were a lot of question marks around him surrounding Trae Young, and whether he was big enough, because he was so up and down. Like when he had a good matchup, he'd go crazy, but if you could body him up and be a little physical, he fell apart. And now, obviously, he's much more consistent, playing a lot better. I'm sure these numbers would be very different if we ran them today. So it's good to realize a lot of the players with high standard deviations are going to be shooting dependent, or maybe even assist dependent for some point guards if their teammates aren't knocking down shots. Someone that gets more hustle stats, I'm thinking, and I don't know, I haven't ran it for him. Let's take a quick look here and see. Someone like Marcus Smart. Okay, so he averages 28.6 a game and a standard deviation 11.45. So he's going to be more consistent than these guys. Let's go ahead and change this to true and see where our lowest ones are at. Yeah, less consistent than these guys, but he's also averaging quite a bit more than all but a handful of them. So that's not surprising to me. He can be a little erratic because he gets hot shooting, but his rebound numbers, his steal numbers, his block numbers are all going to be relatively consistent. Just from a third-party perspective, I watch games, I see him play. I would think he would be pretty consistent. We can also take a look and look at Boston as a team and see what we have. For our most consistent, we've got Daniel Tice. Not surprising, he's just a hard worker, gets in there, does his job, and gets out. Jaylen Brown is very consistent, which is good to see in my mind because I'm a Celtics fan. But kind of the same deal. He hits open shots, he gets boards, and he gets a lot of hustle plays. Enes Kanter, he's going to be consistent, averaging a little bit less, but consistent with it. Gordon Hayward, Jason Tatum, Marcus Smart, Kemba Walker. All right, so that's interesting. Marcus Smart's actually the second least consistent player out of all the Boston players that have played at least 20 games and average at least 20 fantasy points a game. So these are the types of things you can take a look at to help you decide maybe who a better play is given a matchup. In a very good matchup, you would probably rather go Tatum over Brown because he's going to be, a higher average to work with and a higher standard deviation. So in that good game bracket, remember in our bell curve table where within one standard deviation is an average game, +1 to +2 is a good game, +2 to +3 is a great game. In those good and great game scenarios, you're going to be having a wider range off your already higher average. However, in a bad matchup, Jaylen Brown, you're going to be closer to your average one way or the other if you start dipping down. And you may look at this and say, well, I'm only losing, 1 point in standard deviation. I'm getting, 7 points and a higher average to start with. I'll just go run with Tatum. And that's great. Those are the types of decisions you can make by looking at this type of data. All right. So that's all I had planned to go through today. We will have a little bit more on this topic. It may not be immediately after this because I did kind of design this as a 3-video set. And I think we've hit everything we need to hit to be able to use it. We will dive into bringing in minutes and maybe look at minute averages and see how players like doing this same type of analysis but with minutes instead of fantasy points. And then maybe we can combine those two to get a better idea of the consistent players with consistent minutes, the inconsistent players, but it's because their minutes are inconsistent. So if you know their minutes are going to be high, you can assume that they're going to be a high performing player. Fantasy points per minute is also an important stat to bring in for things like this, because if they don't average as much but they play very few minutes but they have a relatively high fantasy point per minute, if you know that they're going to be getting more time on the court, then maybe we scale some of this up. Say, well, he only averages 21 minutes or 21 points a game, but he only averages 10 minutes a game, and when so-and-so is injured or out, he's going to be getting double and triple those minutes. And why you don't just double and triple, like it's not going to be a direct linear relationship, but he will be on the floor more and have more opportunities. And that could be a downside. If he normally plays with the second unit and now he's playing with the first unit, he's going to be lower on the totem pole and maybe get less looks per minute he's out there. So it is a complex equation. There is no one right way to do it. There is no golden egg that's going to give you everything you need in the press of a button. But this is another tool for us to use that I think is going to come in handy for us, especially when we look at it as we defined it in our first video, is trying to decide what types of players to draft and what types of games we're playing, whether it's a cash game or a big tournament. So, with that perspective, I think we've done a pretty good job of laying the groundwork for you guys to take off and incorporate this into your own analysis. So I will leave you with that. Big thank you to everybody in the Patreon for helping getting this going. I'm really looking forward to some of the contributions we've been having recently as far as ideas on how to work with this material in different sports. It's always exciting to see the audience taking that into their own hands and applying it to other things besides what I'm doing right here in the video. Love to see that. If anybody not in the Patreon is doing things like that, drop a line down in the comments. Maybe we can get some discussion going and maybe, you know, combine some different ideas and help everyone get a little bit better. So, as always, check out the blog for the written. All of this whole write-up and everything will be online on the blog, nicksniche.net. Check out the Patreon if you want to be a part of that community. And until next time, good luck everybody with all of your competitions. Thanks.